Hello there, my name's Luke Jennings and I'm VP of R&D at Push Security. Welcome to the webinar. I'm here to talk to you about ClickFix attacks today. So, as a quick agenda before we move on, we're going to start just by looking at the sort of very basics of what ClickFix attacks are, the 101. We'll then dive into the kind of variations that we've seen of them over time, how they've evolved, and they've evolved quite a lot in the last year. And then we'll consider the question of, well, why are ClickFix attacks working? Why have they increased so much? There's a reason behind that. We're going to look into those reasons. And then we'll consider what the good detection and hardening recommendations would be for improving an organization's resilience to these attacks. And finally, I'll spend a few minutes at the end just showing how we're tackling ClickFix directly at Push ourselves with our own product. So, from a 101 perspective, you might have heard other names beyond ClickFix. You may have heard of FileFix as well. You may have heard of fake CAPTCHAs. So there's various names that refer to this. ClickFix is the main one. I'm going to kind of try to stick with that mostly. FileFix is a slight variation we'll consider later. But where CAPTCHAs come in is that CAPTCHAs, or at least fake CAPTCHAs, have been the primarily sort of social engineering context that's been used as a lure related to ClickFix attacks. So that's where the sort of association of that name has come from. But ultimately, ClickFix itself is a social engineering technique to get a victim to run malicious code on their machine. And it does that by injecting into the user's clipboard and convincing them to paste that malicious code somewhere and run it. So ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a social engineering technique, and the end result is malicious software is downloaded and executed on a user's endpoint. Commonly, that's info stealer malware. It can be ransomware. It can be many other things. And what we've seen is a huge increase in ClickFix attacks over the last year. So we saw the sort of first early iterations of this happening at the end of last year, and then a big uptick in them through 2025. So before going any further into variations and so forth, I'm just going to show you an example, because like many of these things, if I show you an example, if you've not seen it before, it's going to make more sense. So I'm going to show you a real ClickFix site that we detected some time ago, and I've got a recording of what it looks like. So I'm just going to visit it directly. We're not looking at the social engineering pretext of how we got here. I'm just going to access the site directly. And what we're going to see is a Cloudflare turnstile-like control on the front of the page. And you've probably seen this a million times for other legitimate websites, right? Cloudflare turnstile is used as an anti-bot protection and control for many sites legitimately, but it also gets abused maliciously for other purposes. And with ClickFix attacks, that emulating that, something that the user's familiar with. But instead of just going through after you click it, it pops out and comes out with these additional instructions and says, hey, you got to provide some additional verification. Hit Windows R, hit Control V, hit OK. And if a user does that, it's going to execute some malicious code. And I'm going to show you what's been entered. Right, so there, I've just pasted into a notepad instead. That is the command that's ended up in my clipboard. Now, I didn't put it there myself. Just by visiting that website and going through that CAPTCHA, it was silently pasted into my clipboard. So if I was to actually run that on a Windows machine, it would execute some malicious code. And that's the basics of what a ClickFix attack is. Almost all of them are based on some variation of that. And you can see how it's pretty easy for a user to fall for it. So from a attack path perspective, we have ultimately something that looks quite similar to other phishing attacks. So we have something where you've got lures distributed through different channels. And actually with ClickFix attack, I'm going to come back to this again later, we've seen a huge number of them coming very much through the sort of Google search and general search engine delivery vector, more so than the other channels. But ultimately, they do come through various other channels, and we've seen with other sort of attacker in the middle phishing techniques them gradually move away from email as the only source to being split across different lures. But ultimately, from a ClickFix example, however the lure is distributed, once you get to the ClickFix page, if the user falls for it, they run malicious code on their device. And in many cases, this is an info stealer. And if it's an info stealer, that means that they have their credentials stolen, and it means they have their cookies stolen. And these things lead to the takeover of business apps and services, just as they would if they got an info stealer through some other mechanism, or if they got hit with an attacker in the middle phishing attack that achieves similar. And the interesting thing here, when I'm referring to another attacker in the middle phishing techniques, is that there is overlap here. It's like the end result is the same, like account takeover. And also, according to Lab 539, they do a lot of analysis of the infrastructure behind attacker-enabled phishing servers. They've looked at some ClickFix sites too, and they found a huge amount of overlap between them. So it does seem like there's a big overlap between the groups running these attacks and the same groups that are running attacker-enabled phishing techniques as well. So how has this evolved in the wild? Well, really, we've seen kind of at the end of last year, the first cases of these were a threat group called Storm 1865, and the main kind of lure that was used to begin with back then was fake Booking.com sites, and it was very much targeting the hospitality sector. And people were getting taken to these fake sites that looked like Booking.com and presented with a fake CAPTCHA, and that's where the ClickFix attack was occurring. I think the end result is that, like many new attacks, if they work, then people double down on them. And what we've seen since then is a gradual use of them by other groups as well. We've seen state-affiliated APTs that are observed using them. We've seen ransomware gangs using them, and they've been involved in different public breaches along that time period as well. We then saw the sort of middle of this year FileFix technique first documented. That became adopted by attackers as well. It's ultimately the same end goal, but rather than, say, doing Windows R, Control V to run a command that way, it does it through a file dialog box. And there are other similar ideas for doing this on other operating systems as well. And that's another good point here, is that to begin with, like many endpoint-based attacks, it started out being completely Windows-focused, but we have seen attackers add Mac and Linux targeting variants to toolkits since then. And we've even now more recently had the sort of the adoption of like ClickFix kits to sort of build your own ClickFix attack. Something we've seen with phishing kits over the years. There's lots of different kits out there to enable criminal gangs to kind of build their own customized attacks, and it's just part of the scaling out of this attack. As it's been successful, we now see sort of do-it-yourself builder kits for doing that. Most recently, we've seen some slightly more interesting technical tweaks where we've seen the use of sort of cache smuggling techniques to get a malicious file on the box ahead of the ClickFix attack, and then combining that with a ClickFix attack to run a command without having to deliver it over the network first. So there have been some interesting tweaks in more recent times too. Okay, so key insights from our own data. So we have some controls against this in the push product. So I'm not going to talk about the product itself at the moment, but just in terms of what we've seen by detecting these across our customer base. In more recent times, the majority of what we've seen has just been, it's a malicious site, copying the malicious code automatically via JS. That's pretty usual. But in terms of the actual endpoint orientated part of the attack, it's been fileless-based attacks using almost entirely either MSHDA or PowerShell when it's been, or at least when it's been Windows. There have been Linux and Mac targets added since. But the vast majority we see are primarily focusing on Windows and using those two things. Now, they come under the term lol bins, if you're familiar, but basically lots of different fileless-based techniques that can be used to execute malicious code on Windows. There are many more, but they're obviously having a lot of success with these two because they don't seem to have changed them much from what we've been seeing. But what we've seen in terms of delivery vectors, which is probably most interesting, is that the vast majority of the ones we're seeing hit our customers have actually been where Google search is the delivery vector. That's the majority. And it's been often legitimate sites as well that have been compromised. So people have been Googling for often relatively niche Google search terms, finding a pre-existing website indexed on Google that's legitimate, going to it. It might even be a website they've been to before, but it's been compromised, and a ClickFix attack has been put straight on the front page so that it goes through that verification step when they first hit the website. It's a really effective social engineering technique. It's really hard for a user to realize something bad is going on. And the only other thing we've seen that's sort of changed more recently is that, now a lot of the sites are dynamically serving the content based on the OS. So if they only support Windows, they'll only serve the malicious content if they think it comes from Windows. If they support other OSs too, then they will serve the correct exploit code depending on the user agent of the person accessing the site. So I've given some examples of Google searches we've seen in real world attacks here. Some of them are, pretty common search terms. Some of them are pretty specific. And we've also seen different variations in the payload. So I said like PowerShell and MSHTA are the common examples. I've just given a couple of iterations of these we've seen, and then I've given another example that covers Unix in the sense of like a bash command. If you're familiar with like fileless attacks against the endpoint, this kind of stuff's going to look super familiar to you. This side of it is the older side. This is things that we've been dealing with in the EDR world for a decade. This is not new. It's really the delivery vector that's the very new aspect of it. So I'm just going to jump through some examples now of things we've detected, just to give you a quick example of like the different variations we see. So I'm just going to flick through some screenshots, really. Here's one website we detected recently. It was like a lawyer from LA, as you might guess from the domain. That website had been compromised. So when you first got to the website, what you can see behind it is the legitimate website, but it would come up with this verification step to begin with. Similar thing for, I think this was Australian based, if I remember rightly, but it's like a sort of pet adoption agency someone had got to through Google. Again, having this kind of verification step put on the front. Another one for, this was, I think, sort of gardening machinery and that kind of thing. Someone was searching to buy something there. It's just a common shopping website, effectively had this thing put in. It was another one for another type of site where you could order products. In this case, I think that example was a laser marking machine. These are the kind of things we're seeing. All of those look very similar, of course. Here's one other one that we've seen where I think this was actually more of a dedicated site that had been set up for it and had a slightly different look and feel, as you can see. And here's another one, whereas I think this was a compromised website too, but it had been put, you didn't see the background of the site. This was a full white page and a slightly different example of the style of the writing that is showing. But you can see, visually going through all these, you get the picture. There's a lot of commonality between how they're doing it with slight variations in how it's been done. But there are still different variations of sophistication. And just to give an example of how sophisticated the sort of professionalization of the social engineering context has become, I'd like to show you an example of probably the most sophisticated one I've seen. I'm going to give you a video this time, because what makes it so sophisticated is it uses your video itself. But this was a compromised website. You get to the front of it. It seems to be protected by Cloudflare. You go through that lure. This one was targeting Mac, because I was coming from Mac. And it actually goes and shows you a whole embedded video of how to do this in Mac Terminal and what you'll see. And it even gives you a countdown, which gives increases the psychological pressure of like, oh, do this quickly before your verification time runs out, and so forth. This is the level of sophistication we're dealing with in these attacks now. So you can see from an average user's perspective how easy it is to fall for this. It's a very effective technique. Okay, so moving on to like, what does this look like under the hood? Now, this is something that's, I guess, quite similar to other malicious websites we see, but I just want to go back to the original example I showed you. And obviously we've looked at everything visually so far. I want to show you, if you're looking at this from the perspective of the underlying code, what you'll generally see is there might be some sort of widget embedded. In this case, it's been done through an iframe. You can see how I've highlighted that aspect. And then this is the part that's common to lots of malicious websites we see, including attacker in the middle phishing sites and others. You've got a whole bunch of heavily obfuscated JavaScript which implements this. And the reason we see this so commonly on malicious websites like that is because it becomes very difficult to determine exactly what it's doing. And it becomes very difficult to write specific signatures, because the code you see is completely different in many cases between different examples. It's very difficult to analyze it. So that's like a pretty generic technique, and it's just reusing the same kind of playbook as other malicious websites. We see the exact same thing with normal phishing servers too. But in terms of the actual technique itself here, that's pretty simple. So if we look at an unobfuscated version of this, there's a few different ways of inserting things into a user's clipboard, because ultimately that's what the technique is. The whole rest of it is just social engineering. You could make a site that says anything you like. That doesn't have to be, that could be something different every single time. But the underlying technique generally involves putting something long and complicated that executes the actual code into the clipboard of the user automatically, so they don't ever see that bit and don't ever deal with it. And all they do is follow a couple of simple commands like hit Control R, hit Control V, and and then hit enter or something. So this is not malicious. This is a legitimate use of an API within JavaScript. But ultimately, you can see we're just creating a clipboard item containing the text that we want, which in a ClickFix example, we would make some sort of malicious command, and then we use a navigator API in JavaScript to just write it into the clipboard. This is used perfectly legitimately by lots of different websites. Like anytime you're not sort of Control-C in something or going, edit, copy or whatever, if you go to something you want to copy and there's a button that says, oh, click here to copy it, you often see it with like code samples on things like Stack Overflow. I don't know, lots of different sites that might have something it wants you to copy. There's often a button. Those kind of bits of functionality on legitimate websites will be using the same kind of techniques. There's nothing inherently bad about this. It's an API that exists in JavaScript for a reason, but this is ultimately what ClickFix sites are doing, and it's it's obviously a very simple thing to do. The rest is just a social engineering context. So the next question is, we've seen a bunch of variations here. Why is it working? Like, why did this come about? Why are people using it? Why is it working seemingly so well? And I think, there's a few reasons for this. One of them is that, at least from what we've seen, is that one's hitting our customers, a lot of them are delivered over unmonitored vectors. So like Google search has been particularly common as a vector for this, and particularly with legitimate websites that have been compromised as well. So in that case, we're sort of bypassing traditional email solutions and so forth. So I think that's one major aspect. I think it also exploits a gap in traditional user awareness. So, it's not typical phishing. We've for decades, we've taught users to be wary of particularly emails, clicking links, opening files, and entering credentials, right? And this is none of those things. So I think it's really a gap in user knowledge. Like, it's not something that your average user is going to realize could be a threat unless they've been explicitly trained on this. So I think that's another really big reason it's working, is the social engineering pretext is really good. The other thing is, I think now in terms of like scale and weaponization, now we've got these kind of build your own kits being created. It's just much easier for new criminal gangs to get going and operate them at scale. So I think it's hit the scale side now, and that's obviously one of the big challenges with attacks becoming ubiquitous and working a lot, is actually just scaling them easily. But that exists now, so I think that's just another reason that we're seeing it working. I think ultimately we're just seeing, it's evading detection controls during delivery, and it's ultimately putting pressure on the EDR as like the only real line of defense, because at the moment it's being used to conduct endpoint attacks, but it's bypassing all the other controls, and it's not a typical vector that EDR has been used to dealing with. So we're in a situation where it's kind of forcing things down to just one layer of defense, and then that's not always working. So ultimately, that's why it's working well. It's a pretty clever way of attacking organizations in a sort of hybrid way, where it's kind of part endpoint attack, but part a kind of unique delivery vector that bypasses traditional controls. So I mentioned build your own kits for ClickFix. Just before I move on, I thought I'd just give you an example of what these things look like. There's more than one as well. Ultimately, it's like build your own. It's like ClickFix as a service. We've had, phishing as a service for a long time. Same kind of commercial model. You pay money by the month or whatever, and you get access to these things to generate attacks for you, and it enables these things to be scaled more easily by criminal groups. So these things exist already now, and therefore we're just seeing the increasing use of ClickFix attacks. Okay, so ultimately, I've been over some of these points already, but to sort of summarize here, like how ClickFix is evading detection, I think there's a real strong overlap here with general phishing detection evasion, but there are some unique components as well. So I think if we look through the phases, like the first point is like bypassing email tools. We've seen similar attacks like attacker in the middle phishing gradually move away from email as a delivery vector and make use of other delivery vectors that are less or not monitored in the past. But email has still generally been the most common. We've just seen a move away from it being completely ubiquitous. Whereas with ClickFix, we're seeing heavy use of Google search, which evades email altogether, and many other controls. And actually, we're seeing that being a very prevalent majority kind of delivery vector in many cases too. So it's almost like jumped ahead in time in that sense. So that's one real key sort of detection evasion thing. We've then got your standard anti-URL analysis kind of features. So we've got like rotating domains, spinning up new sites, and kind of constantly evading TI-led, like threat intelligence-led controls like block lists. So we've got things that they come up, they get affected, they come down. And also, in particular, the compromising of legitimate websites is obviously completely negates sort of TI-led controls as well, because you'll have legitimate sites that are effectively known good be part of these attacks. So that's another common aspect we see that's being reused by ClickFix sites to get around detection too. For scanning tools, this is a really interesting one, because it's almost like they kill two birds in one stone with this technique. But we've seen CAPTCHAs be used maliciously for quite a long time now, with attacker and middle phishing in particular. And the reason attackers use it is that they're able to stop automated security tools from scanning their sites and discovering the phishing component, because they get to the site and all they see is like some kind of CAPTCHA or bot protection. They can't get past that, and then it doesn't look any different to legitimate sites that use the same thing. So that's been used like very well by attackers for some time now. And with ClickFix, they're doing the same thing, except that also that CAPTCHA is the social engineering pretext as well. So not only does it stop automated tools from necessarily finding the malicious code thereafter, but it's also part of how the attack activates when a real user hits it. So that's quite clever, but that's kind of reusing an existing mechanism we've seen in other malicious sites, and then also combining it with the social engineering pretext itself as well. On the page analysis side, obviously, I showed you previously all that obfuscated JavaScript. Again, this is something we've seen across lots of sites, malicious sites, for some time now. But that makes traditional detection rules and signatures harder to utilize. So there's evasion that happens at that level. Then if we come to the traffic analysis side, a lot of this just happens within the browser's DOM. So like things unpack from these obfuscated JavaScripts and so forth in the DOM on the page, and then things get directly put into the user's clipboard. So a lot of these things you can see are basically avoiding obviously malicious things occurring over the network to avoid sort of traditional traffic analysis techniques. And none of these things are perfect on their own, but when you put them all together, you realize how hard it becomes for traditional solutions to detect them. And I think the very final thing at the end, which is very EDR focused, is the code execution method. So they're using fileless techniques like lol bins. This has been a cat and mouse battleground with EDR for a decade now in general, of being a little harder to detect, because they're all legitimate tools. Like MSHTA is legitimate, PowerShell's legitimate. There's a million other tools that are legitimate that can be used maliciously. But the other aspect that's quite interesting here is that EDR can take approaches like saying, okay, this PowerShell is a bit suspicious, and also it was executed by Chrome.exe or Outlook.exe or something else that makes it seem way more suspicious because of where it came from. And I think the interesting thing with FileFix attacks is that they actually are just executed by the user directly, and so it's not easy for EDR to see that they came from effectively an untrusted source like the browser or like an email client or so forth. So that's an interesting method for them as well, and I think it's why it's harder for EDR to outright block these things. So ultimately, we're in a situation where EDR is the last line of defense. It's kind of the only line of defense, because actually, as you've seen, a lot of the techniques we're seeing attackers use here are designed to get around other controls. And so we're in this situation where, in an ideal world in security, EDR is great and it's designed to deal with endpoint attacks. And right now we're dealing with an endpoint attack. But ideally, we like to have more than one layer of defense, right? But actually, most of what's occurring with ClickFix has just bypassed all the others. So you're kind of left in a situation where you've just got EDR and you've got to hope it works 100% of the time. And obviously, it's unrealistic to expect you're going to get 100% out of those things. So it's using fileless attacks that have long been a cat and mouse game with EDR anyway, so you're going to consider bypasses that are potential there. Also, the EDR loses the context of it coming from an untrusted source like the browser because of the way it's executed, so you've got that challenge as well. And I think that leads to alert severity mismatch issues, in that maybe if it was you get something happening that was executed directly from an untrusted source, the EDR might be able to put that as a critical block. But in some cases, you might find things don't meet the threshold to get that high, and so you get an alert, but it's not necessarily fully blocked, and then it gets delivered to the SOC, and you got to hope the SOC finds it and takes action and so forth. So I think that's where the ClickFix attacks are coming to. They're trying to sort of stay beneath the sort of the radar by making things a little bit harder to sort of automatically block on and see as a real critical issue. I think the final thing is just your kind of classic unmanaged devices as well. Obviously, if you're only relying on EDR for this now, then that increases the problems you get from any BYOD devices or like contractors or personal devices if they get compromised. And particularly given we're seeing heavy use of info stealers to steal corporate identities, that also leads to problems if you've got synchronization of credentials via password managers or personal use of Chrome profiles and so forth that are syncing things between corporate devices and personal devices as well. But ultimately, we're in a situation where for most people, if it isn't detected by EDR, it isn't detected at all. And that's the situation we're in where you kind of just got this one layer. So what's the future of ClickFix? Well, I think there's two aspects here. One of them I would say is almost guaranteed, and that is to see wider low bins abuse. Like we've mostly seen MSHTA and PowerShell, at least on Windows. And obviously that being successful. And so I guess, a lot of the attackers out there haven't felt the need to change really yet. But we've seen over the last decade a huge number of low bins be abused in traditional endpoint attacks. There are many of them. It's almost guaranteed that we'll see ClickFix attacks start to use a much wider range of low bins over time. If you're interested, I've got a link there to go and look at some of the different low bin techniques that are out there documented on GitHub. But I think, it's near certain we'll see wider low bin abuse within ClickFix. I think the less certain thing, but the more dangerous evolution we could see would be to stop using them to conduct endpoint attacks and to actually launch browser native attacks. Because at the moment, this became a quite novel, interesting delivery vector, but ultimately people have repurposed them to conduct traditional endpoint attacks. I think where things might get very interesting is if, given that attackers are often using this to steal credentials and cookies and so forth at the moment to conduct identity attacks, if they figure out decent social engineering pretexts to perform a similar thing, but by getting people to conduct certain actions within their browser or execute certain malicious JavaScript within dev tools within their browser, for example, we may see these things pivot to become fully browser native attacks. And at that point, if that does happen, then EDR will be irrelevant. It won't be able to protect at all because it'll be fully within the browser. And then most organizations will be left at that position with having no defense at all. So if that happens, I think that's by far the most worrying development we could have in the future of ClickFix. Okay, so hardening recommendations. There's a few things to consider here. I think the first thing I'm talking about is user awareness. Now, we all know user awareness, it's not a strong control. There's only so much you can rely on your users to do, right? We've trained users for 2 decades and they still fall victim to phishing attacks, for example, right? But it is good practice to do it. And if it's done right, it can provide a layer of defense. And I think what's interesting here and why I'm picking it out is that ClickFix is very different to what we normally train users on. Yeah, it's not related to entering credentials. It's not related to opening files. It's not necessarily related on clicking links from emails. So people, I think, at the moment are generally completely unaware of it. And so I think some user awareness in this space would be good. And I think the only other thing that's interesting is that most of the things we train users about in the past are things we expect them to do legitimately, which is what makes it hard for non-technical users, yeah? Users need to enter credentials into things every day. They need to open files every day. They need to click links every day. And we're trying to teach them in the very small number of cases when it's a bad idea to do that. The thing with ClickFix that's interesting is that really users shouldn't be hitting Windows R, Control V and hitting enter and just running a random command very often. It's not really something we expect them to be doing. So to some extent, it's hopefully a bit easier to explain what is malicious, because really users just shouldn't be doing it at all in most cases. So I think it's very worth considering ClickFix specific awareness and simulation scenarios. The other thing is obviously to look at your EDR. If you're in a situation where your EDR is becoming the only line of defense, then it's pretty generic advice, but go and make sure you've got it configured to block mode or put it into a more aggressive alerting mode. and obviously just like test it out with ClickFix attacks and see what happens to figure out if you've got weaknesses here. And finally, you can restrict code exec as well. So obviously there are lots of different lol-bin methods, and so it's hard to restrict all of this, but at the moment we're seeing primarily PowerShell and MSHTA used on Windows, at least. Like if you're able to block ordinary users from executing PowerShell or executing MSHTA, that would go a long way to stopping these attacks right now. But I'd expect that there's going to be lots of different variations of this in future, so just bear that in mind. But by restricting code execution options, that could provide some good hardening. Okay, so that pretty much concludes the presentation, but I'm going to spend a couple of minutes now just showing you what we're doing in push with this as part of our product. So when we first looked at this problem, we thought, okay, it's an endpoint attack, it's what EDR is for. But we had lots of customers requesting we help them with this, saying, you're in the browser, we really think you could help a lot with this problem, and we're getting hit hard with this, even though we do have EDR and so forth. So they want our help. So then we looked at it and thought, okay, actually, yeah, we could be the first line of defense here, and potentially in future this might move away from endpoint attacks and become browser native, in which case we'll be the only layer of defense if that's the case. So we've looked into it and we've built some capabilities for this. So what we do is we're able to intercept those paste events that I showed you in the JavaScript before, which gives us a really unique insight into what's going on. And so then we're looking for cases where what looks like executable code is being put into the user's clipboard on an untrusted site, for example. And that enables us to provide a first line of defense in detecting this before it even hits the EDR stage. So I'm going to show you what that looks like now. I'll use the first example from the very beginning. This is our dashboard. I've just filtered this so it's not showing any alerts right now. I'm going to go back to another tab and I'm going to load that first ClickFix site we saw at the very beginning. And I'm going to hit the box and we're going to load it just like we saw. Now, you saw before how it put something into the clipboard for me when I copied it into Notepad to show that. What I'm going to show now is we're just going to go back to our platform, and we're going to load the detection. You can see that it's generated a high severity malware delivery alert here, and then you can see the context around the domains, what triggered it. We can also see the timeline involved. In this case, I didn't come from Google search or do things in an interesting way, so it's a pretty boring timeline. I just opened a new tab and pasted the URL directly. In a real attack, you'd probably see a more interesting timeline than this. And then also, as with all our detections, we will show a screenshot of what the user was seeing at the time the detection was generated. So you can see that's what I saw when this was triggered. So that's how we're dealing with this. Now, I've showed this in a detection-only mode, what we call monitor mode right now. That's the first release that we made available is using that. We will shortly be releasing a config update to allow block mode too. If you've seen our platform before, this will look familiar, but basically instead this is what a user would see once the detection was triggered, so it would interfere with the user's flow too. In this case, we will also be making the command paste safe too, just in case they were still able to go and try to run that command. We will be interfering with that as well to make that safe too. That will be due out soon. So the detection only mode is already in the product, already out. The block mode will be in the very near future. Okay, so that concludes the presentation overall. Thanks for listening, and now we'll move on to any questions.
Great, excellent. So we've had a lot of questions come in so far, but you've still got time to ask questions if you haven't managed to ask your question yet. So please drop them in the chat. But yeah, we'll start from the bottom here. So is this impacting a certain region, or is it a worldwide problem?
It's a good question. To be honest, I haven't really looked at it from a regional perspective, so I'm not sure if it's more or less common in different regions. I mean, from push, probably the majority of our customers are either in the US or Europe, so I definitely know it's happening in both of those regions. I have much less familiarity outside of that, I'm afraid.
Okay, yeah. I mean, from what I've seen online, it seems to be a sort of global problem. But yeah, appreciate that. Okay, next question. I think we answered that one actually, yeah. So does the user need admin rights to be impacted?
No, not necessarily. It obviously depends on the exact payload, but generally speaking, most endpoint malware out there for a long time has been designed to work without admin permissions, because it's been common in corporate environments to have no admin permissions for a long time. So generally speaking, you wouldn't be required to have admin permissions to be impacted by it.
Okay. Next question. Are browser extensions such as Chrome's ClickFix block effective?
Okay, I'm not actually familiar with that extension, so unfortunately, I can't answer that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, my comment here would be, like, obviously we've just demonstrated that browser extensions can be effective, but one, installing random browser extensions, if not trusted or verified or whatever, can probably cause as much harm as good, to be honest with you. There's a good chance that things out there are malicious or can become malicious if taken over or whatever. So I think without further investigation, we wouldn't be able to say, but generally, as a general point, I think browser extensions can be an effective defense against this. But yeah, okay. Does push have the capability to block the command from getting copied or saved to the user's clipboard?
So right today, no. In our development version, yes. That's coming soon, effectively. All of our controls, we tend to release the first version in detection-only mode as we're building the controls around blocking mode. So that is literally quite advanced in our development pipeline soon. It'll be out soon. So
effectively, that'll make it safe, essentially, so that the user can't copy the malicious command.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I'm building a custom query language detection for decoded commands using IEX or IWR to hunt for ClickFix. Since we can't block PowerShell or Win plus R, is this a solid approach, or would you suggest tracking patterns like clipboard copy events followed by PowerShell within seconds? Quite a long question there.
Okay, so I'm assuming that's relating to like EDR telemetry, looking for evidence of malicious PowerShell. I mean, that's kind of just going back to really the EDR question. If so, I mean, of course, looking for malicious PowerShell is a good thing to do. It's just whether you're going to get all of the commands with that, and it's as they adapt into the future. I mean, I think if you're able to look at time windows where you've got evidence of clipboard copy events as well, and you've confirmed that however you're getting that source of data actually triggers with a real ClickFix event, then you could obviously increase the severity of alerts or cast a much wider net by saying, if these things occur within a very short space of time, then it's a more significant event. I imagine that would be more effective, but you just have to test that yourself.
Yeah, I suppose the one thing here is that it might not happen within seconds because the user might take a bit of time to read the command, understand what's happening, particularly if the malicious sort of copy happens immediately on the user arriving on the page. So it could be minutes even if you wanted to take that route. But
yes.
I think, like, generally, I suppose user initiated PowerShell is potentially a higher risk at the moment, but if you increase the severity of things, you run the risk of false positives and things like that. But yeah, I think right now it's probably a higher risk event than what it would have been once upon a time before this sort of stuff. Yeah. Okay. Is push an extension, or is it installed on the system?
So it's a browser extension. So yeah, you can deploy via your MDM or whatever, and then it will sync back to events back to our dashboard that you can access for your tenant.
Yeah. So we've had another question on pushes detecting and blocking. So yeah, right now it does not eliminate the code that's placed in the clipboard, but it will very soon as part of the next iteration of the tool, or the control, sorry, and that we're expecting that imminently. So yeah. Would you consider FileFix being an evolution of this attack?
Yeah, I mean, sort of. Yeah, I obviously mentioned it very briefly, but didn't demo it specifically. It's just it falls in the same kind of criteria, but it's at the end of the day, it's just executing commands as well. So I feel like it's a small variation of the core attack that fits within the general thing.
Yeah. How effective is normal ad blocking / filtering against ClickFix?
I don't think it would really affect it at all because they're not coming in as ads. So the only thing would be if like the way you were arriving at a malicious site in the first place was via malvertising, then potentially like that. Obviously, ad blocking can potentially save you in those cases. But in most of the cases we've seen, are users visiting what are actually legitimate sites that have just been compromised and had ClickFix put into them. So it wouldn't really help you in that case.
Yeah. Next question. How does push work with an existing EDR?
Well, I mean, we're an extension in the browser, so we just sit side by side. We don't integrate or interact specifically with any EDRs. We're just a separate product to that. So we cover the browser, and EDR covers the endpoint.
Cool. There's a bit of a tangential question on agentic browsers that I'm going to skip over, sorry, because I don't think it's super relevant in this case, but drop us a message and we'll potentially be able to answer that separately. How does push prevent session hijacking?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's quite different to this this presentation.
Yeah.
We do actually have some controls in place for that around being able to tag requests that we make and correlate that on the back end based on if you get like cookies that are stolen from a browser with an info stealer, you can then detect if they get reused elsewhere without the same push extension involved. But yeah, I don't really go into too much detail beyond that because it's a different topic.
Yeah, that's
we do have a control for that in the product though.
Yeah. Okay, just to verify, push doesn't have the ability to look at all clipboard events, but rather if the domain were attempting to inject a payload into the user's clipboard. Is that right?
Depends on the way you view it. I mean, like from an extension perspective, we are obviously intercepting these things to be able to analyze them within the browser. In terms of what we're reporting back, though, we're not just blindly reporting back every copy and paste event because there's obviously major privacy considerations with that. In principle, we could, but it's like a pretty blunt instrument to do that. At the moment, we are focusing in on just detecting instances that we think are malicious and then eventually blocking those. At the moment, just reporting detections on those.
Yeah, it might also be worth adding that you can whitelist certain sites as well, or allow list certain sites to say,
yes,
our shell can be copied from this site or whatever, and it's legitimate. So yeah, there's ways and means of tailoring the control to reduce the sort of false positive rate and what it's triggering on as well.
Yeah, you can ignore domains. I mean, we obviously deal with false positives and improve things over time anyway. I was just trying to think out loud about the most common things you might encounter. If you've got blue teams and red teams on like training sites doing malicious PowerShell stuff and copying commands as part of their training, then that's probably exactly the sort of situation where you might trigger a false positive there. But you can go and ignore any domains you like.
Yeah. On average, how fast does push detect these attacks and alert the security team?
Well, if you saw in that, like it's pretty much immediate in these particular cases. Like if you saw in the demo earlier, it was within a few seconds I'd switched to the other tab and I clicked to refresh, the event was there. So yeah, I think at least in ClickFix examples, it should be within seconds that you'll get that. It's however long it takes to go from the extension up into our AWS backend and end up on the UI. So it's like, yeah, of an order of seconds really.
Yeah, but it's effectively like a real-time
sort
of control. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So does this also block ads or not, like an ad blocker?
No. Unfortunately, yeah, we can't do that as well. This is specifically tuned to malicious copy paste events that occur as part of ClickFix attacks.
Yeah. Okay. Could ClickFix impact a mobile device?
The ones we see at the moment, no. I mean, in principle, might someone in future develop something to implicate mobile devices as well? Maybe, because it's quite a generic technique. But at the moment, what we're seeing is very focused on compromising desktop endpoints.
Yeah, yeah.
Multiple OSs though, not just Windows. It's like macOS and Linux targets as well, but it's very focused on desktop OSs.
Cool. Okay. I think, yeah, one final question just to end. Is there a generic way to block clipboard copy in the browser without a browser extension?
So yes and no to this question. So like I've seen there are restrictions you can put in place on the clipboard permissions within browsers, within Chrome and Edge. Like with Edge you can do it through group policy and things like that, or with Chrome you can do it through managed policies. The thing is, it doesn't really stop this attack because what it's relating to is general clipboard access without user interaction. And what generally happens with ClickFix attacks is that it's entirely unobvious to the user what has happened, but really as long as they click, like any form of user interaction, as long as they click on something or whatever, then that becomes a trusted event and that overrides any restrictions you put in place for clipboard paste. So like the fact that you click on what looks like a Cloudflare turnstile, you don't know as a user that that's actually pasting something into your browser, but from a browser's perspective, that initiates the user interaction, makes it a trusted process, and allows the clipboard to be interacted with. So unfortunately, at least the main mechanisms I'm aware of, they are more focused on no interaction clipboard access and clipboard reads, but that's not related to clipboard. ClickFix is purely based on the write, and that's always allowed when there's been a user interaction event.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for now. So thank you very much for all of your questions. If we didn't manage to answer your question, please drop us a message separately and we'll do our best. But yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. You'll all receive a copy of the slides, of the recording for you to share and view in your own time. And yeah, we hope to see you next time. So thank you very much. Cheers.